And that's why to simplify it, I always tell my athletes very simply, you don't use your leg like a hammer, use it like a spring,
Mm.
you know. And what's interesting about it, this is the natural way to do it.
Yeah.
It's natural. It's our default. Like you take a person and you have them to do simple hopping types of exercises or whatever. That's the one thing they're going to do perfectly on the very first day because it is the way the human body is intended to operate.
That was Boo Schexnayder, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. If you're in the world of sports performance, you've probably heard of jump testing mats. These mats use hang time to measure total jump height or contact time to measure quickness abilities off of the ground. The best jump mat that I've come across also happens to be a sponsor of this show, which is the plyomat. The plyomat is not only accurate, easy to use, and affordable, but it also allows you to string multiple mats together to add an extra dynamic to plyometric testing and training. To check out the plyomat, you can head to plyomat.net. That's plyomat.net. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. It's great to have you here, and I'm excited to welcome back to the show Coach Boo Schexnayder. Boo has over 40 years of experience in the coaching and consulting fields. He's regarded internationally as one of the leading authorities in training design, and he's been a huge contributor to the coaching education fields. Boo is well noted for his time with the LSU Track and Field staff, and he's coached numerous Olympians and World Championship medalists. On the podcast today, Boo will be talking about proprioception in training. So how do we look at the role of the sensing apparatus of our muscles that detect where we are in space and help us to skillfully control movements? How do we go about looking at the role of that apparatus through things like complex training, where we're combining, for example, light and heavy weights, or where we're doing things that might leave those proprioceptors more fatigued, like a series of higher volume or heavy squat work? We'll also be talking about the obsession with drills, so common in coaching, versus high-speed whole part athletic movement, so getting in the motor learning aspect there. We'll be talking a lot about reflex, spring-like action in jumping and sprinting versus, you could say, more overcoaching versions of that skill. We'll be talking a lot about pelvic and lumbar mechanics in running, Olympic lifting thoughts, and much more. It's always awesome having Boo on the show. Let's get to the episode here. Boo, it's great to have you back on the show. Got a ton of questions. Somehow I doubt I'm going to get through all of them. Maybe I will today. But hey, I appreciate you being back on here. I'm looking forward to our chat today.
Thank you, Joel. It's always a pleasure. I always enjoy talking to you.
So I have this one for the first question. I know we've talked a lot about some of the contrast that you've done in the weight room, like having different weighted barbells and things like that, running in contrast. I don't know if I've asked you as much about doing things of a contrast nature out on the track or for speed work. So things like mixing sleds with regular sprints, or an overspeed type stimulus with a regular sprint, or anything like that, or with plyometrics. I'm curious how contrast works its way into speed for you, and when you would find it the most appropriate to start having more advanced waves of things with that equation.
Well, I appreciate you asking that questions because I have some definite thoughts on it. But when I look at complexes in general, and I kind of look at complexes the same way, whether they're on the track, in the weight room, plyo complexes, whatever the case may be. Basically, what you're doing there is you're complicating a training stimulus, and more complicated training stimuli bring about better adaptations in that regard. What we're trying to do is not give these athletes things that they can handle and things that they can master immediately, but we want to give them things that there is a certain amount of nuance to it in order to enable them to ultimately master things at a higher level. I think a lot of these contrast methods, what they do is they're playing proprioceptive games. Some of them alternately fatigue and rebuild proprioceptors. And as a result of that, you get a pretty complicated training environment, and therefore really great adaptation, and also a certain sharpness comes proprioceptively as a result of this type of work. So I do this work, I'll have different combinations of resisted work. I don't do much assisted work anymore, but I'll do different combinations of resisted work and non-resisted work and things of that nature. Sometimes I'll have varied weights on the resisted work within the same session and whatever. And to be very frank with you, I don't have a lot of formulas that are really exact. I just kind of change it up. I just think variety is good. I was fortunate. I never finished my PhD, but I did start it. And one of my professors was one of America's foremost motor learning experts. His name was Richard McGill. And one of the things that he drilled into my mind is that variety in practice improves transfer to the test. However, variety in practice often decreases the level of practice performance. What I'm saying is you mixing these things up and throwing these things at athletes and such is very likely to make them struggle in the practice environment. But then when it comes time to actually do what they have to do, if you got them in shape and proprioceptively sharp and you put them out there, it all gels, it all starts to shine. And that's a tough thing for a coach to wrap their head around, particularly a skill-based coach or a feeling-based coach, because you're always thinking in terms of good technique and perfect technique and such, but he kind of drilled into my mind that, yeah, there's that practice where the kid comes out and does every repetition perfect, but there's also that practice where the first few reps suck and then the next few reps, you coach and it gets a little better and the next few reps get a little better. And by the end of the practice, things finally look pretty good. And sometimes in many ways, that practice might be more valuable than the one where everything goes perfect. So in short, that's kind of my way I look at complexes, period, is diversifying the practice environment in order to achieve a more complicated training stimuli. Now, but to answer the second part of your question, I don't think complexes are necessarily good or applicable in all times of the year because sometimes they're at such a high level from a proprioceptive standpoint and a complexity standpoint that they're out of reach for certain people at certain times of the year. So I like complexes at two times of the year. One time of the year is like late specific prep, and the other time of the year is to use them at some extent during your peaking time. If it's, if you're like going to the collegiate track and field model, for example, if you start training on September 1st, what's the use of doing a complex when everything that you're doing is new to the athletes anyway? Everything's new to them at that point. But when you fast forward to Thanksgiving, or Christmas time, and now all of a sudden they've seen everything that you have, and there's a certain, not mental staleness, but a certain physical staleness that comes. This is when the complexes are great to break through that and to produce some type of nuance to the training that you're employing. And then, of course, during the peaking times of the year, the complexes are effective because ultimately we have to be at our proprioceptive sharpest for these types of activity at these times of the year. So why not have something that challenges proprioception at a higher level? So in short, I think that when you do complexes like in the really early stages of training, it's kind of like playing your trump card far too early and at the wrong time. And it just kind of wastes an opportunity that could be really, really valuable at some other time.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned, when athletes start the season, it's all new to them. You could do I mean, that's where training can certainly be its absolute simplest. I know we've talked about that quite a bit throughout our conversations together and not needing to add unnecessary complexity to it quite yet. It is interesting, like with the trump cards, I know we've talked about that too, where I think one way of looking at it is simply, and I think it's good, is just finding more intense pieces of training to lay down throughout the year. But I think that if we only go with intensity, we don't think of, like you mentioned, the proprioceptive piece or the motor learning piece, it can actually just go, like you would have the mentality of, okay, we're going to go from deep squats to half squats to quarter squats to max isos to a 2-inch step up with 700 pounds. It's almost like just intensity. If you're only playing intensity, it almost can get a little ridiculous and a little one-sided versus, okay, let's bring in more the motor learning piece to up the intensity and you have more pieces to put in the equation. I think it's a much more robust training stimulus versus I think it's easy to just get very one-sided with that or only thinking of, all right, we're going to go from 200s to 150s to 100s to, whatever. It just fits with how we learn as humans more. It just feels kind of like feeling like a basketball game. That's how I always put it too. How do I feel after a basketball game?
That's a good way to put it. And, complexity is a form of intensity in a lot of ways. We are producing not just speed, power, we're all producing skill. Athletes, we're trying to develop athletes that are receptive to skill acquisition. So That's a big piece.
Yeah, you've mentioned proprioceptive sharpness a little while, and it's a term I think like I feel what that is. Like intuitively, at least, I get that. I'm trying to kind of put it into words in my head, or think about an example. I know one. I remember when I was working with swimming at Cal, one of the pro swimmers actually had said his. I think there's different things you do in the warm up that kind of give your body an idea of how good you're going to be on the day. And one swimmer had said, he said the better he was at doing just handstands in warm up, like just a free handstand and his ability to balance himself. He's like, if I was really good at that, I knew it was going to be a good training day. And I don't know, it's almost like, because it's like everything's involved in that. There is a strength piece, but it's also like your nervous system can kind of react to rebalance your hand faster or something like that, and it's just kind of, to me, that was almost an example. And I wouldn't necessarily, after he said that, I didn't have all the athletes be like, all right, measure your handstand and we'll use that to determine your one. I didn't go there, but it was interesting to think about that, because I've kind of felt that too, at least from that kind of balancing type standpoint. So I'd just be curious I know you've mentioned it a lot of times with the proprioceptive sharpness, but if you could unpack that a little bit, I would be curious where your mind goes with that.
Yeah, sure. I really think that there are certain things you do in training that sharpen proprioception because they're stimulating to the nervous system. I see proprioception as an extension of the nervous system, basically. Mostly if you look at gamma loop systems and things of that nature, it's neural in function is what it really is. But that being said, some types of training sharpen that, and some types of training fatigue it. And anytime you do something that's going to fatigue the proprioceptive systems, you're going to have to expect a certain decrease in coordination, certain decreases in elasticity and things of that nature. Elasticity, because a lot of these proprioceptors are involved in elastic responses and such. So, and we kind of know that exercises that are long, slow, heavy ones typically fatigue proprioceptors, and it seems like power-based stuff that we do seems to sharpen them. So alternating them takes these proprioceptors through the yin and the yang, so to speak, of the extremes. And ultimately, when we get to competition, we want to be at our proprioceptive best. And leading into a competition, it's important to understand, I think, that you want to steer away or at least have supplied sufficient recovery from any of the bouts of exercises that are likely to produce severe fatigue, like these complexes that we mentioned a little while ago, or more importantly, like weight room complexes that involve like some of your French contrast stuff and whatever, they kind of, that's what they do. They alternately damage and restore proprioception within the context of a simple workout.
Interesting.
So that's fine, and that's that's a good way of doing things. But you do have to look at the back end and allow yourself to recover completely from those proprioceptive fatigue situations before you go back out there. For years I've kind of operated on the premise of what I call proprioceptive supercompensation. You're not going to find it in the literature anywhere, but I use it on a very regular basis in my speed program. We'll do like killer squat Monday, and you fatigue these proprioceptors. And most speed power systems, if you do something like that on Monday, you're back sprinting again on Thursday, and you're ready to sprint on Thursday. But I've always found that on Friday you're even sharper, and I always felt that was kind of because of proprioceptive bounce back, meaning that you got this situation where you drove the proprioceptive systems down, and they recover and they regenerate, but eventually they'll supercompensate, and you'll find that athlete's going to be actually sharper than they would have been had you not wrecked the proprioception. I'm using wreck as an extreme term, but
yeah.
the point I'm making, had you not wrecked the proprioception on Monday. So that's why for years in the speed power models I have, like in specific prep, you pretty much see things like squat Monday and speed development Friday in the work that I've done, is that I found that that's the best way. Ultimately, we always think in terms of peaking for competitions, but I think it's important that you peak for certain key workouts as well. So that's kind of my take on it. And I think that the Golgi tendon organs in many people are just chronically undertrained, because people, even though they do the right stuff in training, often don't do the ballistic stretches and things like they do. They need to affect those thresholds and so forth. So it's a big piece. And just generally observing the principles of variety and variance in your training is a good way to start. not getting caught in the rut doing the same things over and over again is a good place to begin as well. So, in short, I guess those would be my thoughts on it. I don't think you have to be a proprioceptive genius from the standpoint of knowing biologically exactly what's going on in all situations, but I do think that you have to have an appreciation for how certain types of work affect them. Coaches for years and years have identify the fact that things like explosive multi-throws and some types of Olympic lifts and even simple things like skipping for height and distance seem to regenerate proprioceptors to some extent. So I just think these are the models that we're ultimately looking at. And when new forms of contrast training or new forms of um, of complex training come out, I never see any of them as groundbreaking, frankly. I just see them as a new variation that somebody found cool and wrote something about, whereas the actual principles involved in them are no different than the principles of any other complex training design. And again, not taking anything away from those people, but I just kind of lump them all in the same box in that regard and use them appropriately.
Yeah, I think with that in mind, it's like the original complex training was really just playing a sport. Like I even think about playing basketball or something. Like you're gonna run down on the court, up and down the court a few times. You're gonna get a little fatigue, but then you have to find a way to jump anyways and sprint anyways. And hopefully the fatigue isn't so overwhelming you just can't. Usually, if it's so overwhelming, you just walk for a little bit or jog and take it easy so you can regenerate your system and then go start sprinting hard again. And you might not be 100%. I mean, I think you can overdo that. You play too much or. It's I always found the sweet spot for that was kind of like a pickup game intensity, and then pickup game intensity. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, but I was going to say you're correct. And if you look, another key variable in like a game like that is the plyometric effects and the contact times. The change of direction is long contact time, plyometric type of activity. Then you got the responsive jumps and so forth.
Yeah.
So you got a wide variety of different things all plugged in there.
Yeah, exactly. And it was funny. I was just kind of looking in. I was writing an article about contact times. I had to go back and look up. Well, what's a 180 cut? What's a complete a 90 cut? And it's really cool to look at all the different. I think we can, especially in a track and field situation. We can atomize things and be like, all right, this is this time, this is this time, and I think that's good. It's good to know, but at the same time, you play sport. It's kind of cool to know the contact times and see someone doing a change of direction. Okay, they got their longer contact time. Okay, here they got their shorter one. And I think back to I feel like I think sometimes coaches are known for telling stories repeatedly. Oh, hey, coach told this story about 10 times this year, so I'm going to be that guy now. But I this is just a story for me. As the highest I touched jumping in high school in basketball was I got 3 inches over the top of the square at about 6'6'1", and it was after doing a bunch of change of direction, like sprints at the end of practice. And that stimulus, man, it just did something to get my one leg jump it really assisted that to a point beyond, whatever, if I would have just gone and done a typical warm up or something like that, or tried to be super specific. All my contact times in this warm up are all specific to this jump. It was like, no, like doing the change of direction contact and this mixed with the sprints and the short contacts. Something about that got me really fired up. So it's that pieces of that have always kind of stuck with me where it happened organically. And yeah, like it just with that as a base, like this training has always existed. It's always been wired in the system. We can now just take it and put new pieces in when athletes need it and have those principles. But I agree. Even it's interesting too, because I mean, you've been through all this. Do you feel like in the 80s and 90s when like Giles, Cometti, and I think I had this as a question, but like I think that's when a lot of the complex and Werner Gunther, that's when it seemed like the complexes were really getting creative. To me, it's almost seemed like it's actually been a little bit of a pullback since then in that end of the creativity. I'm just curious your thoughts on that piece of it.
No, I'm very familiar with his work, and in the track and field world, I think every coach that video of Gunther training and doing those complexes that he was doing went viral, and and it was kind of a hot topic for a long time. But I think part of that is just human nature. It doesn't mean that any of the training was discredited. It's just that we always seem to be ready to move on to the newest, coolest, sexiest thing, whereas sometimes the things that we used to do are perfectly fine and really serve the purpose possibly even better than those things that we're moving on to. You and I both know that coaching, and in particular the performance coaching world, of the strength and conditioning world, is sadly fad driven, and in many cases, we're we got hot topics that aren't thoroughly researched and whatever, just because of social media, YouTube hits, and things of that nature. And that's just always a little bit of a scary thing for me. I get roundly criticized quite often because I'll regularly teach a strength and conditioning course, I should say, to coaches, and we cover topics like weight training and medicine ball training and plyometrics and body weight circuits and all of these things. And they'll get really upset because we're not covering some of the cool topics. They'll ask why, and it's simple, because in 2 years, all of that stuff will be gone, and there'll be a whole another new set of cool topics that you're upset that we're not covering in this class if you take it a second time. So that being said, I try to be the person that doesn't move as quickly. I try to check the ice before I step on it, so to speak, regarding these types of things. I'm the person that when Windows 10 came out, I still bought Windows 7 because I wanted to make sure all the bugs were out of Windows 10. I think there's some value in that to some extent, and not always, sometimes being the cool person is not always necessarily the best thing. And going out on the limb first is never really necessarily a good strategy.
Today's podcast is sponsored by TeamBuilder. TeamBuilder is an online software for coaches and trainers, and I've continued to hear great things about the TeamBuilder platform. If you're looking for either an in-house training portal for your training groups or an online training hub, be sure to check out the TeamBuilder training software. Yeah, I've seen that like bell curve of adapt. There's like the early adapters. That's like the very small percentage. It's like whatever the new thing is, they're doing it. Somewhere in the middle is probably the most consistent, in many ways versus always trying that.
That bell curve is a good analogy. There are always people on the edges of that bell curve that are doing, work, but you still got to be in that curve, you can't get outside of it.
Yeah, I think where the novelty, it's interesting because, to think about being in the 80s and 90s and seeing that novelty coming out through like the Werner Gunther type stuff, or the Giles Cometti type stuff. I feel like more the novelty now, because I don't think personal training was really a thing back then. And now it is. So it's almost like a lot of the exercises now are more, they actually take the exercise and just one exercise and add a bunch of steps into it. It's like, all right, we're doing plyometrics, so let's slam a medicine ball and do a burpee tuck jump. And it's almost like where I feel like back then it was just more playing with different exercises, and now it's almost like, it's my opinion, but I feel like now people take single exercises and make the single exercise have more steps to it and more twists to it or something like that, where almost more like a general population type, I don't know, or just exercising, just finding new ways to exercise versus it seemed like at least back then it was more linked to motor adaptations and things like that. But that's just my perception when I do see people's iterations of creativity now, or a lot of creativity now.
No, I think there's some truth to that. I think that in many cases, trainers are kind of scratching the surface on a lot of things and aren't really going deep enough to really get significant, sustained adaptations in speed, power, or endocrine responses, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, a lot of the depth. Would you say a lot of the depth really, this is kind of where I've gone, but I feel like the missing depth, or if I had to say the number one missing depth piece, I feel like it's motor learning. Just like that process of learning, like I think you said either before I got started with the show, like it can be messy sometimes. It's like we always want to see this perfect thing or replicate the perfect exercise. And I just feel like that's a huge piece of the depth. And I know you have a huge background in that. So, I am curious if you think that, like, and maybe we can go to the drill piece as well. Like, why do people love drills so much, and why? I'd be curious for you to chat a little bit about that depth of motor learning and some solid principles there that maybe can transcend like just exercise selection and help people to make better decisions.
Yeah, sure. I think we've already discussed how variability in practice eventually affects improvements in transfer, even though the practice might necessarily get worse. But motor learning is unanimous. Of course, motor learning research is all pretty much done based on simpler skills, but motor learning research is unanimous that whole learning is better than part learning, meaning that if you practice the entire skill, the rates of improvement are far greater than if you break it up into pieces and then try to assemble those pieces. Now, I'll be first to admit that in a lot of sports situations, the skills are so complex that you really can't, for example, tackle the entire skill on the very first day of training, right? If you're, for example, teaching someone who's never done it before how to pole vault, well, you'll never get them to do pole vault on the first day. So, yeah, you have to break it down. But if you do break it down, bigger chunks are better than smaller chunks. There's so many rhythmic factors. There's so many elastic loading factors that link different phases of a movement together that once you start to take them and break them apart, they never get the nuance that's associated with them. And in many cases, that's the most important thing, I hate to use track and field examples, but I remember one time I used to do a lot of work with a track coach. His event that he really liked to coach was triple jump. And he had terrible triple jumpers, but he loved coaching it. And when I saw him lecture at a clinic on triple jump, he did a phenomenal job in the lecture. So here's a guy who obviously knows his stuff in triple jump, but it's not happening for him, the actual coaching practice. And then one day I got to watch him coach, and the athletes came down the runway and they took off. And the only thing they did was take off. They didn't do phase one, phase two, phase three. They only did the takeoff, and they did that like 5 or 6 times, right? Then they did 5 or 6 repetitions where they only got to do the first phase, and 5 or 6 reps where they only got to do the second phase. And at the end of the practice, there were only a few reps where they actually practiced the entire event. And my point is that was the missing link there, meaning that it was too broke down. The rhythmic issues, the elastic loading factors that link those phases were not able to be trained. You learn a lot of things that come from things the coach doesn't say because of the perceptions and our own personal error correction methodologies and things of that nature. None of that was being allowed to happen. So in short, that's why, that's inarguable. And that's why I've never been a big drill person per se. Ultimately, we as coaches really like drills because they're typically pretty easy to teach. And they're kind of a comfort zone for coaches as well, I think. When you look at drills, I've had coaches tell me, oh, this is a great drill because in this drill, they have to do it right. That's not true. Nothing is idiot proof. Idiots are geniuses in their own way, And in that regard, I've seen so many people, I don't really have many drills and I don't care to have many drills. I prefer to practice parts of the event. The drills that I do and the drills that I have, I really like them. And the main reason why I like them is because they're more economical from a time standpoint, meaning that I can get far more repetitions in a short period of time in the drill than I can in the actual event or sport or whatever it is. So most of the drills that I do are that they're just amplifying opportunities for repetition more so than the actual sport or event themselves, and they're very specific in that. The other mistake people make is that they stick with drills far, far too long. If you told me you're going to do drills for a few weeks at the start of your practices and then move into the complete skills and such, well, I'm fine with that. But to go on and on and on and on with them, again, it kind of tends to be a comfort zone. And now all of a sudden you're about to go to a competition and all you've been doing is these simple drills and stuff, It's amazing to me how coaches spend so much time looking at what they want to do as far as phase layout. When's my general prep? When's my specific prep? And they look at all the details, but they don't truly understand that there are phases of skill learning as well. And you have to move through those phases. You would never think about bringing an athlete into a high level competition without having done some type of general preparation and specific preparation. Well, why do we bring athletes into high level competition when in the skill side of it and the motor learning side of it, all they've done is a very remedial general preparation?
Yeah. It's like, if you think about it from, I love that. It's like thinking about it from, my mind lately has been on like grades. And I think about, okay, if you're doing a drill that would be like grade 7 and your actual event is, grade 11 or 12, why are you doing 7th grade, like the fundamentals of 7th grade math over and over again? You don't need to keep doing that. It. Like, you don't need to keep coming back to this it's almost insulting in some ways. I feel like if you taught a class that way, it'd be kind of insulting. And I think about like, you know, like even like someone like Mac McClung in the dunk contest this past year. You see this athlete doing these incredible dunks. It's not like he's like he didn't go to warm up. He's like, oh, I'm going to practice my plant here, and I'm going to, you know, you don't see those basketball players like going through their takeoff steps. They just go do it, and they do it on such a high level. It's just amazing. And when they practice, I'm sure it's just warm up, maybe shoot around, pick up game a little bit, go dunk, you know, and it's not like, hey, I'm going to do the fundamental drills that lead up to my dunk a million times. You know, I just think it's kind of humorous to think about.
Yeah, I think when it comes to skill learning, we lose sight of the most important factor in training, and that's the overload philosophy. You know, like quite often, I think what happens sometimes is that coaches remediate something and they just stick with it at a remedial level until it looks perfect. But the bottom line is it's not going to look perfect until you actually apply a little bit of intensity, you know. So quite often coaches, you know, they're hard headed. Like, yeah, and I understand it, but like we're not going to move on with more intensity or more speed until you can do it at this slow speed perfectly. It'll never be perfect until you introduce the intensity. You know, that's the factor there. You know, to supply that type, you know, I try to move on with higher levels of intensity, not when an athlete shows total mastery, but when they show decent mastery. And then you challenge them at a higher level. And that way, I know when you used the example, but I know I took algebra one. I made an A in it, but I really didn't understand it at a deep level until I took algebra two. And that's the way sports work. You know, it doesn't make sense. It's kind of like saying, look, we'll let you sprint when you get fast, or we'll let you lift weights when you get strong. No, you would never do that because sprinting is where you get fast and lifting weights is when you get strong. So why do we apply that backwards philosophy to skill development? It just, again, doesn't make sense from a motor learning standpoint.
Yeah, it is. It's almost like, I hate to use the term red pill. I just think it's so overused, like the pill that changes your whole life and philosophy and, you know, thoughts on things. But I do think that a big, I guess something like that would be that, like this drill based perfect form, reducing perfect form down to neat little drills is actually not serving athletes well. I think
No, it really isn't. No question.
Yeah, but then that goes with that though is just this world of, oh, like how does the athlete actually learn? It is messy. It might not look perfect. And I think there is this thing of, it's almost like if you've never been exposed to that way of thinking, you just do what everyone else does, which is try to do the fundamentals perfectly, this reduced version perfectly. And then you keep coming back to that because, well, hey, we did something perfect today. It's almost like this addiction to do this simple thing I know I can get you to do, you know, quote unquote perfectly. But then it's almost like you get into the actual event and I think you start to almost frame the actual skill under that, like wanting to control everything in the skill too. You know, like the coach you mentioned who it's like, oh, well, we'll do phase one till it's perfect, you know, and then we'll do this little part of phase two till it's perfect. But then you put the whole thing together and just didn't fit versus like, well, it just going through it and being sloppy and I'm quote unquote sloppy. It's not really sloppy because the body's learning and giving them opportunities and just being able to see things from that perspective. Even back to what you said about the proprioceptive stuff where I was just making this connection too. It's just really cool to think like I've been through, excuse me, like neurology type classes where they'll say, okay, well, you did this bilateral lift and it you know, down-regulated your nervous system because you did like a squat and you did a toe touch and the toe touch got worse because it, you know, your nervous system didn't like it. Well, it's like, well, does that mean it's bad? Like, you know, does that mean you could never do it? Like you're saying like, all right, well, use that as a challenge to the system, you know? And yeah, that's where doing that stuff in a contrast is so, yeah, don't think of it as just, oh, this is wrong. Think of it, yeah, this is a challenge. How can you adapt to this? Doesn't mean you have to like do that squat in crazy volume all the time, really heavy, but you can think of it it's just how you think of it, I think, and how you think of the adaptations that can happen from it.
No, things that harm us short term tend to strengthen us long term.
Yeah.
What's the old saying? The basic thing behind coaches, does not kill you, makes you stronger to some extent. But I do think going back to what you said previously, I think another drill addiction thing for coaches is that a lot of coaches are really good at cueing things and teaching skills at slow speeds, but they don't know how to teach them at fast speeds. You know, ultimately the things you say, the cues you use, the methods you use to teach things at slow speeds don't typically work at fast speeds. So You got to be versed in cueing and teaching at slow speeds, drill speeds, but also you have to be able to cue and teach within the context of the sport itself and within the context at the speeds, I should say, of the sport itself. And a lot of coaches just aren't comfortable at doing that. They try to go back to the same old things that were effective at slow speeds. Things feel entirely different to the athlete's body at that point. When things speed up, you got to have different cue systems. Like I've never been a big fan of like learn by doing clinics and things of that nature, because I've always had a coach, show me how to do the drill. Okay. I'll show you how to do the drill. Cause if I can do it, I'll know what it feels like and I'll be able to teach it. No, you don't, like if I go out there and I learn how to do a whole bunch of long jump drills, do you really think it feels the same way it does to an athlete who's coming down at 11 meters per second, and taking off at 11 meters per second? No, it's entirely different. So what it feels like to you is entirely different to what it feels like to a high level performer. So ultimately, we need to be investing as coaches in our cue skills, our ability to identify verbiage, our ability to identify things that will bring about the responses we need at high speeds. And that's like the weakest part of practically every coach's game, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's just where it's harder to learn that in a book or a teach me this in 1, 2, 3. I think that's where, because that's the easy way to learn, right? Like, and again, I think there's a place for that, but it's like that's not as easy and it's different with every athlete too in so many ways, and it's just something you start to feel over time. I'm curious with just at the level of more concrete things, though. I am curious just to kind of fully explore the idea. Is you did mention there are some drills that you like, and I know you've mentioned too the idea because I've thought about this, or I found myself thinking about this over the past few years since you mentioned it, at least on a few occasions. But the idea of like helping an athlete get 80% of the way there, like technically, and the last 20% is their own. And I think that might not fit entirely with this, but I am just curious how you look at that. I guess you call it like the fundamentals or learning the basics or the first 80%, drills. Like where does that first 80% fall with some of those things? And then versus the athlete, becoming more autonomous in the process as they move forward.
Yeah, what you said is very accurate in my opinion. I don't know if it's 80% or 90% or whatever, but there's some threshold there that you teach, and at some point in time, the rest of it is kind of up to the athlete. Every athlete has their own rhythmic sense. Every athlete has their own internal error correction mechanisms. Now, you see athletes get better with no coaching at all. Mm-hmm. So obviously there's some error correction that just takes place naturally with athletes. And you don't have to have a great athlete to do that. All that exists in all of us. So many times I see tiny details of skilled movements being addressed in ways that are paralyzing athletes when, quite frankly, like you want to get them in the ballpark and let those little tiny things work themselves out. For example, like double knee bend in the Olympic lift. And, there's all these arguments, teach it, don't teach it. It happens, it doesn't. It's inarguable that it happens, but it happens so fast that it's really difficult to cue effectively. And as a result, a lot of people who have tried to cue it have wrecked athletes and therefore claim it's not a good thing. But we see it happen all the time. And every sport has its own set of things like that, things that are so subtle and at such high speeds that it's difficult to really effectively cue them. But if you build the surrounding pieces around it, you understand what is cueable and teachable and what really isn't. You get them close enough, they can connect the dots the rest of the way.
Supplements may not be the core of a total nutrition and human performance program, but they can really support and enhance the process. On the level of supplements, Lost Empire Herbs has been my go-to for the last 5 years. As someone who's constantly observing nature and motion to help me understand movement better, so too do I draw from nature in my supplementation regime. If you want to check out some of my favorite supplements for energy, strength, and enhancing the total impact of your training regimen, things such as Shilajit, which has been well recommended by many strength coaches, the Phoenix Formula, which was my original Lost Empire Herbs supplement that really made me a believer in the power of herbalism, things like pine pollen, mushroom tinctures, and more, you can head to lostempireherbs.com/justfly. There you can use the code JOEL15. That's JOEL15 for 15% off your order. Definitely check out Lost Empire Herbs. They're an awesome company and will really help that total aspect of your performance training process. Yeah, that's part of the fun too, is seeing them connect the dots. You know, it's not fun. It wouldn't be fun at all to coach and be like, all right, here's my manual. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Everyone do it exactly this way. 1, 2, like, well, I don't know. I just would not find that way of coaching very fun, you know, especially if that's how it was the whole time and throughout an athlete's career. Like, it's part of the fun is seeing how athletes solve that problem and knowing that not all athletes are going to solve that problem exactly the same way, and looking at some of the different strategies people use. It's interesting. So
it's not an assembly line, you know, it's coaching. There's a difference there, you know. Yeah, maybe you take your freshmen through an assembly line of drills and progressions and so forth and get them to a certain point. But at some point in time, your coaching becomes reactive and a little less hands-on. It just must, it should.
Yeah. And like you said, at some point, there is a beginning of that, where more of that is certainly present. I know I've taken athletes through the positions. You're going to go through, you know, these positions in the Olympic lifts, teaching Olympic lifts to college athletes. But it was, even within that, it was interesting to me to look at some of the strategies, like the double knee rebend and things like that. How did athletes process when the bar is below the knees to that midpoint? Because not everyone did that the same way. And honestly, I didn't get, unless it just looked absolutely crazy outside the bandwidth, I usually didn't even mess with it that much. I'm like, as long as this isn't like, I had some athletes like purposefully taking their knees way back and then just smashing their thighs in the bar to be like, hey, I did it. And honestly, I'm like, you know what, if you're a swimmer, I really don't care that much, as long as you're not hurting yourself and the bar's going up and you feel good about it. But it was interesting to see how people would even just process the instructions that I was giving them. It made it fun, honestly, with that. But yeah, I agree. There's that time for more technical, more, you know, step. But then it very quickly becomes, there's a lot more nuances. You start to get through it. I did want to ask you as well, actually, going back just a little bit, but just to kind of close out the complex stuff with, like, in the speed world. I know you've given some examples of different barbells, like different barbell weights are going like down a line and things like that. And I am curious if you have kind of some more favorite setups with like sled contrasts, or even working plyometrics, or even maybe a little touch of fatigue, like a longer sprint in a contrast. Any things that you really like doing over the years that really stand out to you in that world?
The thing that I really like, that I've kind of made my money off of, is contrasting plyometrics with ballistic lifting. So like some type of jump movement that's loaded at about maybe 10 to 15% body weight, alternated with a jump movement that's unresisted. Because ultimately, I think that when part of competing is not just perfect execution, is dealing with imperfect execution and making the best out of imperfect execution. And I think that good athletes have to be versed in a wide variety, to some extent, of contact times and coupling time situations. And I think this is where you can effectively do that type of stuff. You know, I think that quite often in many situations, we tend to get into plyometric worlds that are too overly focused on highly responsive types of things, and kind of lose sight of the fact that everything we do is not going to be perfect. It's not always going to be perfectly responsive. So we have to be able to deal with a wide variety of things. I know when I go to places and consulting work and I see bad change of direction, that's typically what I see, is lack of diversity and poor organization in the plyometric programs in most cases.
Interesting. So you're saying, if athletes are poor in change of direction abilities, they need more diversity, like more diverse plyometric movements that will eventually, just doing those will help them to self-organize the change of direction, versus, hey, you're going to change direction just like this, put your foot here and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm not too big on the whole, here's the cone, plant your foot here, stick this foot here, put footprints down on the ground and try to, I'm not too big on that kind of stuff for the reasons I mentioned earlier. But yeah, I think the term you use, self-organize, is that's what you're ultimately building, because there's no way you can address all of the situations you'll ever see in a game in any way, shape, or form. I got a colleague right now, and kind of talking about foot contact patterns. And one of the points that I was trying to make is that our bodies seem to be able to organize that. If you have high impact situations, quite often you see heel to toe rolling kind of contacts. Lower impact situations, you kind of see more forefoot and so forth. And we don't coach that. The body just kind of anticipates what the force is going to be and puts itself in best position to accept those forces, amortize those forces. So why would you short circuit what the body's inherent movement organization principles?
Yeah. Within that too, it's like always one thing with coaching. It's like always putting that self-organization on a very high respect. Like the athletes.
If you're good, you do, yeah. But if you don't, you think you're smarter than the self-organization and you overcoach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of overcoaching, actually, one of the, this was one of the first pieces of technical coaching that I think I read from you. And this was, this was like probably 15 years ago now. And I remember it so clearly because I was at this track meet and there was a guy coaching triple jump from another team. And this is when I was like 25. So I'm still trying to figure out, a lot like cues and what do I say or do or expect. And there was a guy coaching triple jump and it was like, of course, in the middle of the meet, which is like funny. And he's like, no, you really got to like paw your leg aggressively down to the ground. And I was like, I think I read Schexnayder say that you shouldn't do that. Let it be reflexive. And it's funny because he was doing it in the meet too. And so I am curious, like in how you coach something like even like a bound, like the self-organization of letting athletes be reflexive in a bound versus like let's really drive your leg down. And then I'm also curious of how you would think that might work into sprinting, because I know sprinting gets popular to like paw the foot down to the ground, where versus letting the system maybe choose a little bit more. I'm just curious your thoughts on that principle of things.
I just try to be respectful of the way the body organizes elastic responses. Anytime you have an elastic response, you're going to have isometric preparation prior to ground impact, like muscles around the ankle, quadriceps are going to tense up in order to prepare for impact. Then when the foot hits the ground, there's a certain amortization, and that's where your elastic responses are generated. And then, of course, you push up off the ground. Well, anytime that you are trying to attack the ground in the incorrect manner that you mentioned, basically what you've done is you've gone immediately to concentric and you've eliminated the isometric and the eccentric phases, and you've eliminated the opportunity for any type of elastic response whatsoever. And we all know that we produce much bigger forces through elastic responses. So in the bounding and hopping and those types of exercises, yeah, you do see the foot move backwards a little bit before it hits the ground. But if you actually measure the speed of the foot, you see the split actually slowing down prior to impact as opposed to speeding up prior to impact. When I was first kind of delving into all this stuff, of course, Giles was kind of one of my heroes, and I did what he did. I pulled out a whole bunch of old 16 millimeter videos and was looking at them. And what was interesting is that I saw these triple jumpers and the foot's moving back. But when the foot was moving back, you didn't see the hamstring ripped. You saw the quad ripped. So that was telling you that, it's pretty much just gravity and the continuance of cyclic movement that's really bringing the foot down to the ground. There's really not any grabbing or pawing or any of that stuff going on at that point. And that's why I, to simplify it, I always tell my athletes very simply, you don't use your leg like a hammer, use it like a spring, and what's interesting about it, this is the natural way to do it.
Yeah.
It's natural. It's our default. Like you take a person and you have them to do simple hopping types of exercises and whatever. That's the one thing they're going to do perfectly on the very first day, because it is the way the human body is intended to operate. And that's the way I look at so much athletic movement, is not trying to teach the body to do something that's foreign, but to teach the body how to do something that's really inherent and natural. I remember when I started coaching real high level people, man, I'd be out there having them accelerate. They would sprint, I would coach. They would sprint, I would coach. And I'm talking and they're sprinting and they're getting a lot better. 2 years later, I keep my mouth completely shut and they get better anyway. And that's when I realized that all of the training you're doing was building an organism that was basically able to execute that which is pretty natural in many situations. Like on the farm, we cut a chicken's head off; it would still run around the yard. So it's not like sprinting is something high tech that requires all of this brain power. So that being said, that's the way I kind of look at those things, you know. And I know one of your things that you kind of set me in advance. You were talking about one of my I'm a fanboy of Ken Clark. I really like Ken Clark's research, and he's got stuff out there with negative foot speed and so forth, and sprinting. Moving the foot back and so forth. And his research supports exactly what I'm saying. Negative foot speed is not a new thing by any means. It's an old term that goes back to the Seagrave, days in the early '80s and so forth. By no means. And we do see, typically as athletes get better and sprint better, we see the foot moving back at faster rates with respect to the center of mass and so forth. But just like his research shows, that it's not a linear progression. It's a U curve, and there comes a point at which, if the negative foot speed is excessive, then now what we sacrifice is the elastic responses at impact, and we see a flattening of that sinusoidal curve of the body's center of mass, of the undulation of the center of mass that's important in such a big elastic energy producing factor in sprinting disappears. Just like anything else, is it important? Yeah. Can you take it too far? No doubt. And that's I think what Clark is saying. To be honest with you, I agree 100%.
Yeah, I'm glad you got to that research, because I had sent you that, and it fits actually the latest study that him and his team put together fits very much with what you were saying with the triple jump leg coming down. I'd never heard that before, that triple jump leg actually slows just a little bit before the ground, which I'm like, that's so cool, because instantly my mind went to the that latest research that Ken Clark put out, which did say, yes, as athletes get faster, there's more negative foot speed. But in the fastest athletes, or with very fast athletes, or like you said, there's that curve where in the highest speed, that ground speed difference actually isn't 1-to-1 anymore. It's like there is that preservation. Because like even I said, maybe with pure linear thinking, like even with intensity, all I can do is this one thing and just get more intense, more intense, more intense. But there's more shades in there. I think it's like the same thing in the sprint cycle. It's not just one thing. It's not just the foot coming back, but there's the elastic response piece as well, and how it gets timed and managed throughout the whole body. And but it's also really cool when you see that, because it reminds you the body is really complex. Like there's something that's really, I think that's amazing about having a human body that has things that are continually just a little bit beyond our full understanding, that, oh yeah, it's doing this too. And so there is going to be that little slowdown so the body can sync itself up and get the best elastic response unique to itself,
Yeah, every jump contact, every sprint stride is a deceleration and a reacceleration. It's about maximizing the efficiency there rather than minimizing the deceleration.
Yeah. So within is there any situation where you would instruct an athlete to, like you said, that with the quad as well, like that's so cool. The hamstring was not active, like the quad was, and gravity was helping pull the leg down. I'm sure like the swing leg too, like the swing leg helping and the lead leg working together in harmony to create the ultimate optimal elastic response. I mean, do you think there's any place for kind of like the attack the ground or any sort of interface, downward interface to the ground, and how that's coached or instructed, or any thoughts there with that?
Well, when it comes to cueing, I never say never. Like, I say the wrong thing in practice all the time and get good results, because of over cueing or radical cueing or whatever the case may be. But generally speaking, I try to stay away from foot centric type of cues when it comes to impact and force production and so forth. I'm a firm believer, and I think it's been proven through EMG studies and research, that running really originates in the vicinity of the lumbar spine and the pelvis. That's where the engine effectively is. And what the legs are actually doing is amplifying the movements of the pelvis, the oscillations of the pelvis. And there's some transfer of elastic energy from the pelvis into the legs, the pelvis moves, and you have pre-stretches set up on hip flexors and hip extensors, and that's what ultimately produces gait. And what I've seen is that when you get really hardwired into cueing, like foot strike, and hardwired into like hit the ground hard, those types of things, what I often see happen is there's a bracing effect that takes place in the vicinity of the pelvis in anticipation of that. And basically you shut down the pelvic engine that you really need to be effective. So generally speaking, I try to steer away from all of those types of cues, and I try to direct my cues more upstream as far as sprinting is concerned. If I want more intensity in sprinting, I'm looking at more amplifying pelvic oscillation. I'm looking at the femurs, working through bigger ranges of motion. I'm cueing in that area of the body as opposed to the feet. Like if you got a car, your car won't run. You don't go to work on the tires.
Yeah, I love that. It makes me think a little bit, and this is just something I've been experimenting with a little bit, especially since I've got the little Lila Exogen micro weights, and I'll place those, and now I have more angular momentum on limbs. But what I notice, it's interesting because what I notice is I actually notice more intensity and rotation happening in the pelvis and lumbar area. It's almost like the center where it all originates is now it's getting pulled harder, and you're feeling it happen. And to me, it's almost been a cool exercise to feel where, like, if I want to run faster, where's the initial impetus that this all starts from? Like it has to start from the center. Like it has, the dantian or whatever, like that central, just below the belly button or whatever, somewhere in there. Something in there has to change first, because if I try to change the extremity first, like that's just going to mess up the timing of the system. It's got to start. Something has to start somewhere else, more towards the center of the body. I guess core gets overused too, right? Because you could say core and be like, oh, well, brace your abs hard. Well, that's not going to work, So.
Yeah, that's another whole issue is, how, core in sprinting and jumping moves, it doesn't, stabilize. And, we say neutral pelvis and things like that, but you have to see the pelvis move into posterior tilt and then anterior tilt in small degrees in a repeated fashion. Rigidity only guarantees you injury for the most part,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's like Kidway Johnson, the hammer thrower, who was on this podcast, and I like something he said. It was basically something to the tune of every extra thing I put in the athlete's head to think about or manage while they're doing the skill is going to take away from their full potential, and just always being conscious of that. And like, a cue on the pelvis might keep the pelvis from being able to oscillate like it's supposed to, I mean, maybe it gives some feedback in the short term, or whatever, you feel how it goes but at the end of the day, you can't run and hold your pelvis a particular way intentionally. It's going to make it hard for that system to move.
There's, I've been battling it for years, but there's still a fundamental misunderstanding about how athletes run and sprint. Basically the pelvis, that vicinity is the engine. The lower leg is in the foot. They're force transmitters. They're not big force producers in those situations. And the upper body is just countering, and balancing. Every good therapist in America will tell you that if you are if your mobility is restricted in one body part, next door in an adjacent body part, you see hypermobility. And of course, the reverse is true. But we still have coaches that are screaming at athletes, work your arms, work your arms, work your arms when they get tired. And you just as soon be telling them, tighten your hips, tighten your hips, tighten your hips. It's the same thing. So it's disappointing, the lack of sophistication that we typically approach these issues from sometimes.
Yeah. How would you go, like, if someone had, like, let's say their posture isn't good, they're stuck in an anterior tilt, let's say, or that kind of archetype. I mean, how would you go about, like, drawing awareness to the pelvis, bringing like that into the training sphere without taking away from their ability to move? Do you have any principles for training that center, the pelvic mechanics and things like that, without at the same time overcoaching or putting possible rigidity in the system?
Well, first of all, when I see anterior pelvic tilt, I always identify faults in the acceleration process. So to me, posture is not a condition, it's a skill. I can identify a mistake in the acceleration process for every single athlete who shows anterior pelvic tilt when they get to maximal velocity. I don't care who it is. I'm talking about, I very seldom say 100%, but I'm saying 100%. Meaning that if I'm coaching you in acceleration correctly, you will not have anterior pelvic tilt upon entering maximal velocity. Now, sometimes people have slight complicating factors like they overlift or over squat and lumbar spine gets tight or hip flexors are tight or whatever. But suffice it to say, that's only 10% of the puzzle. 90% of it is skill based, and we're kind of hardwired for the pelvis to oscillate. And then, of course, the other big problem is under conditions of fatigue where we start to lose posture sometimes. That's why when I see conditions of fatigue, I'm typically asking athletes to really focus hard on looseness of the pelvis or freedom of movement of the pelvis and maintaining amplitude of movement in the femurs as they sprint, because that seems to preserve. Remember, we
Yeah.
preserve pelvic alignment not by stiffening it up in a position, but by it continuing to move effectively in the way it's intended to move.
Yeah. That's really interesting with acceleration. Would you feel like that's because like an acceleration is more front side dominant than when you get upright, where there's more of that balance wheel? And then when the femur's in front of the body, it kind of naturally pulls the pelvis into a little bit of a posterior to get the leg in front, or something else?
No, I see the mistake as being impatience about lifting the head and the torso.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah. So, like, if every athlete, and I mean every athlete that I've ever seen who has anterior pelvic tilt upon entering max velocity, I can identify a stride in the acceleration pattern in which the head and the chest rolls without a commensurate movement of the pelvis. The head and the torso lifted independently. That's why I never like to use the term stand up when sprinting. I want to use the term push up, meaning that the body angle change is actually a result as a product of the vertical components of those foot strides, not because you're trying to lift the head or lift the chest. So you don't stand up, you push up. And of course, that's cueing semantics, but I think I'm being accurate as far as, the kinetics of the movements there.
Yeah. And you say that kind of just starts from a fundamental disconnection kind of between the rib cage and the lower body too, where like the upper body is almost doing something different where the legs are spinning.
That's the result, but that's not the cause. The cause is a technical flaw, a bad habit, which is often produced by a misconception of, I need to get tall, so let me pick up my head, my chest, when we haven't done that process. We haven't executed that process correctly. I'm going to go back time and time again. It's not a pathological issue. It is a technical issue. It's strictly a technical issue, and coaches don't value it enough.
Yeah,
I can't tell you how many times I get the coach, anterior pelvic tilt, check the acceleration. I did, coach, it's perfect. All right, send the video. When I get the video, sure enough, there it is. Coach just overlooked it, or coach didn't think it was important, or whatever, but there it is.
Yeah, makes sense. Just a couple other quick questions here, Boo, before our time is done for the day. Maybe these are, I don't know how connected these are with the theme of the rest of our conversation. Maybe this one is with the wave loading. I'd actually heard Jeff Hauser had said something to me about this with like an up and down wave loading in the gym, like doing Olympic lifts, doing a heavy set, a light set, a heavy set, a light set. I'm curious with your thoughts on the contrasting that type of contrast in the gym, results you've seen or any preferences there.
No, he's getting some good results out of that. And I've started looking at using a couple of lighter sets as potentiation types of sets there. But I do, I don't do it much because of the fact that I feel that most of my potentiation is accomplished elsewhere outside of the weight room. So I think it's a really good model. Its validity and its use is predominantly in situations where an athlete might be lifting but doesn't have other components of the workout, meaning that they're coming into the weight room after a warm-up and not necessarily after a sprint session and a plyo session moving into those things. So I think that's partly what Jeff is exploring there, is ways to potentiate when you don't have the luxury of doing that, those other training components in that regard. So other than that, most of my heavier stuff, I'm pretty much sticking to heavy days, so to speak. I just think there's some unique forms of potentiation that go on there, and I want to take advantage of them. So it's unquestionable. I've seen what he's doing. He's explained it to me, and it's unquestionable what he's getting out of it. But I feel like I'm getting those same results through potentiating the weight room through outside of plyometric circuits.
Yeah. I guess, just if nothing else, it just speaks to the universal principle, and it could show up elsewhere in the program very easily. And definitely makes sense with that one. Very last question here. I know if you get on Twitter, you'll probably guarantee within a few hours see something about the ever running debate of Olympic lifting for especially non-track athletes. I think it's It'd probably be rare to have like a jumps group that did an Olympic lift, in track. I don't know if I've seen that. But then once you start getting into team sports, a little bit different story. Just curious on your thoughts on that kind of spectrum of things. Track, team sports, Olympic lifting, any place where it might be not the best use of time or anything like that. Your take.
To me, Olympic lifts are the best thing you got. I mean, when that bar comes off the floor, it's moving slow. It's absolute strength. When the bar speeds up, it's power. When you catch it, it's reactive. So you got complex strength development. So all of those complexes that you want, the Olympic lift is one big complex. Here we go. And then, you have these unique rates of firing, hip, knee, ankle, lower body, upper body sequencing is put at a premium in the Olympic lifts. So I see lots of skill development come out of it. I see lots of technical transfer come out of it. And the other nice thing about Olympic lifts is that there are no negatives. You don't have any proprioceptive dysfunction that results from it. Outside of maybe immediate fatigue from the workout, there's practically zero negatives associated with it. So I got this thing that's tremendously effective. I got this thing that has zero negatives associated with it. So why would I not use it? So I use Olympic lifts with everyone for those reasons. I just see too much skill development coming out of it. If I'm coaching you in chess or checkers, I'm still going to probably make you Olympic lift, to be honest with you, because I believe in it that strongly. Now, that being said, I've had many coaches. It kind of is one of my pet peeves, coaches who are just trying to find ways not to Olympic lift. And sometimes coaches come to me from sports with poor lifting cultures, and they have substitutes. Well, we do jumps, we do trap bar deadlift, or we do trap bar jumps, or whatever the case may be. And I understand there's hip, knee, ankle firing and those types of things and so forth. But the thing that Olympic lifts do that you cannot match anywhere is the sequencing, the hip, knee, ankle. Yes, you can get hip, knee, ankle from lots of things, multi-throws, jumps, whatever. You can do that in lots of ways. But I don't know of a single training modality that challenges the sequencing in the ways that Olympic lifting does, okay? Like when you put 90, 95%, 100% on that bar and you got to do a heavy clean or whatever, I start seeing things breaking down, as far as hip, knee, ankle sequencing, upper body, lower body sequencing. And I want to challenge that. I want to challenge that because that basketball player in the fourth quarter, when they are, the reason they missed that shot is because upper body, lower body sequencing are out of sync at that point. So I think there are things that you accomplish in Olympic lifting that you don't accomplish anywhere else. Now, one argument that I get that is a valid argument is that, well, what about the athletes who just can't do it quite correctly because of this or that? I have long arm kids and they can't get their elbows up on a clean catch or whatever the case may be. I'll live with that. I'll live with it. When I'm dealing with Olympic athletes, with most of the athletes that I coach, if they come off the floor correctly, shift the hips and extend the hips correctly, and the extension is correct and on time, and the upper body follows in sequence, I'm good enough. I'm fine with that. So if they don't shrug quite perfectly, or if the elbows don't quite go where I want them to go on the catch, whatever the case may be, I'm fine with that. Again, we're not lifting to be Olympic lifters. We're lifting to improve ourselves in our sport. But there are certain faults that I'll deal with, in that regard. And there's certain things that I just totally won't compromise technically. And the ones that I won't compromise are ones that I think that any athlete could and should be able to do effectively, regardless of their body type. I remember one time I was brought in to do a clinic, and I was doing this clinic, and there was only a few presenters, and one of the presenters was an Olympic lifting guru. And he was really good, and I learned a lot from him, and I really enjoyed his talk. And he was so good that I did something that I never do. I asked a question of him at the end of his presentation. And I asked him, well, what about the long arm athletes that you have trouble getting them into the really good catch positions? And he said, well, I don't let those people Olympic lift. And I left heartbroken because after a wonderful talk, this guy, it's like, well, all I know is if I didn't Olympic lift with those athletes, I would have never gotten invited to speak at this clinic. I promise you that, So that being said, that's my take on it. And, you can email me an entire list of different activities that you think are as good as Olympic lifting and do the same thing as Olympic lifting. And I'm I'm just not buying it. Like I said, when I watch sports and I watch the breakdowns in technique in critical situations, whether it's pressure or fatigue that's producing these critical situations, to me, the only place that you're able to challenge the sequencing in that manner is through your Olympic lifting program.
Yeah, I definitely 100% agree with you with the patterning, like an Olympic lift compared to like a trap bar deadlift. I know, like, it's almost like in some, you could even maybe not. I was just thinking liken it to like a drills. It's easier to do a trap bar deadlift perfectly or a jump because it's extremely simple. And in some perspectives, or in a lot, I think it's great to have those simple pieces that are completely foolproof. But like you said, like the delayed knee extension piece with the Olympic lifts, like being able to wait to extend, it's like a vertical jump. The way that an Olympic lift unfolds is much more similar to a vertical jump, things like that. I definitely, and when you do it well, you also feel it. And so it's just the thing I guess I think about is why coaches who say, oh, we got rid of the Olympic lifts and now our teams are, I got athletes running faster, jumping higher, whatever. I always want to go into that. So, I always want to kind of see what was going on in there. From that,
I'm not buying it. When I take Olympic lifting away from athletes, they do worse. So I don't want to make a single case study or extrapolate that. I don't know how the Olympic lifting was done. Was it done properly? Was it scheduled correctly? Like anything else, it's got to be done correctly. Technically, it's got to be scheduled correctly. It's got to be done at the correct intensities and so forth. And I don't want to say that I'm belittling those other activities. Just about everything I mentioned as a potential substitute for Olympic lifts, I don't think of them as effective substitutes, but I do all of those things in my program as well. So I want to be clear on that as well. But that being said, when a coach tells me we got better when we stopped Olympic lifting, I got a really hard time buying that if the Olympic lifting was done correct.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd always be curious to go into those programs and just kind of see what's going on too. I just think it's an interesting topic, and interesting to get your perspective with that for sure. I know I myself am definitely a heavy user of Olympic lifting. I enjoy them, so it's good to get the different perspectives. I'd say the one sport I didn't definitively was men's tennis, working at Cal. But outside of that, other sports, track has always been heavy. Output sports, even like swim, sprinting, like it seems like it goes hand in hand with output sports real well. And I don't know if like the mentality with that, as well. But
it's all about power output. Yeah. People think Olympic lifts and, they don't look at a concentrated training experience for any particular muscle group. And therefore they kind of poo-poo it. But at the same time, we forget that ultimately good training programs drive global responses like neural responses and endocrine responses, and that's why you live there.
Yeah, I know the home base Olympic lifting protocols and things like that have always been near and dear to my heart. So, well, hey, Boo, thank you so much for your time. I hope it didn't take you too long today. It's always good talking to you. I love getting these topics. I love getting in the motor learning piece too, especially. And I just really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much.
Oh, no, it's a pleasure. It's always nice talking to you, Joel. You always leave a little smarter because you stimulate me as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you next week.